When we picture medieval warfare, the mind often leaps to grand scenes filled with endless lines of armored knights, flags soaring in the wind, and the thunder of thousands of horses charging across vast open fields. Popular culture has entrenched this vision so deeply that it feels almost inseparable from how we imagine the Middle Ages. But this image, however cinematic, does not reflect the historical reality of how wars were actually fought between the 5th and 15th centuries. In truth, most medieval battles were surprisingly small in scale, often involving only a few thousand men, and sometimes even fewer. The reasons for this are complex and rooted in the very structure of medieval society. From limited population sizes and fractured political authority to poor infrastructure, weak economies, and the decentralized nature of feudal military obligations. Rather than grand, sweeping engagements, medieval warfare was shaped by logistical restraint, strategic caution, and local power dynamics. Understanding why these battles were so much smaller than the massive engagements of antiquity or later modern wars not only gives us a clearer picture of medieval conflict, but also challenges the myths we've built around chivalry, conquest, and the supposed scale of knightly warfare. Number 1. Ancient and medieval numbers. The scale of military conflict in the medieval world is often misunderstood, largely because popular imagery and fiction have painted an exaggerated picture of what medieval battles looked like. We're used to imagining tens of thousands of armored knights charging across open fields, flags rippling in the wind, and entire landscapes covered with soldiers locked in brutal combat. But when we examine the historical records and compare them to ancient warfare, the contrast becomes clear. And it's not just noticeable, it's dramatic. In the ancient world, especially during the height of imperial organization, like in Rome or Persia, the sheer number of troops mobilized for a single battle could dwarf anything seen in the Middle Ages. The Roman Republic, even before becoming an empire, showed this capacity repeatedly. In the Second Punic War alone, the Romans fielded armies that reached staggering figures: 40,000 at Trebia, 50,000 at Lake Trasimene, and 90,000 at the catastrophic Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. Within a short span, Rome put close to 200,000 soldiers into the field, backed by a highly organized logistical and administrative machine that could support those men over long distances and extended campaigns. Rome's capacity for such operations wasn't unique. Alexander the Great, centuries earlier, marched into the heart of the Persian Empire at the head of a 50,000-strong force and faced opposition forces that, according to some classical sources, may have doubled that number. What made this possible wasn't just population size. It was a combination of bureaucratic efficiency, road networks, taxation systems, and a centralized state capable of coordinating resources across vast regions. These states, especially Rome, relied on a system of roads and supply depots, standardized training for their troops, and a professionalized military that could function year-round, regardless of season or harvest cycles. This level of organization gave ancient empires the ability to project force at a scale unmatched in medieval Europe. In contrast, the Middle Ages operated on an entirely different model. After the fall of Rome, Europe fragmented into smaller, often competing kingdoms and feudal territories, each with limited centralized power. The feudal military structure relied heavily on personal obligations and seasonal service, not permanent standing armies. Kings depended on the loyalty and cooperation of nobles, who in turn raised small levies of men from their own lands. These forces were inconsistent, rarely well-trained, and usually available for only limited periods, typically 40 days per year. As a result, most medieval armies were significantly smaller. Fielding 10,000 men was considered an exceptional achievement. Many documented battles involved as few as 2,000 to 5,000 troops per side. Even some of the most pivotal clashes, such as the Battle of Hastings in 1066 or Agincourt in 1415, involved relatively small numbers by ancient standards. This wasn't due to a lack of military ambition, but rather the constraints of medieval society. Lower population densities, limited financial systems, fractured political authority, and poor infrastructure all contributed to a reduction in the scale of warfare. What's even more telling is that medieval chroniclers often exaggerated numbers for prestige or propaganda purposes, which means the real figures were likely even smaller. The impact of disease, poor nutrition, and the slow pace of communication also meant that armies could rarely assemble quickly or in large numbers. Mobilizing and sustaining a medieval army required logistical improvisation. There were no state-run food depots, no dependable roads, and no tax-funded supply chains. Armies moved slowly, often relying on local foraging, plunder, or short-term contracts with mercenaries. That made it nearly impossible to field large forces for extended operations. In sum, while ancient warfare could call upon the resources of vast, integrated empires, medieval military campaigns reflected a world that was more localized, fragmented, and logistically limited, resulting in battles that were, by comparison, remarkably small. Number 2. Why medieval armies were smaller. The limited size of medieval armies cannot be explained by a single factor. It was the result of an intricate mix of population constraints, fragmented political authority, economic underdevelopment, and logistical limitations that shaped how medieval states functioned. One of the most fundamental differences compared to antiquity lies in population density. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire had a population approaching 100 million, supported by urban centers, a cash-based economy, and integrated infrastructure. That scale of demographic and administrative unity simply didn't exist in medieval Europe. For most of the Middle Ages, England had a population fluctuating between 1.5 and 3 million, while France, one of the most populous regions, rarely exceeded 15 to 17 million until the late medieval period. Sparse populations spread across rural villages couldn't sustain large concentrations of troops. The available manpower was minimal, and more importantly, the systems for mobilizing that manpower were deeply inefficient. Political power was another critical issue. Unlike the Roman emperors, medieval kings lacked centralized control. They were not absolute rulers, but figureheads within a feudal network of landholding nobles, each with their own agendas, armies, and spheres of influence. When a king needed soldiers, he couldn't simply command them into service. Instead, he had to rely on the goodwill or legal obligation of his vassals, who were often reluctant to serve unless their own interests were at stake. Even when they did comply, they rarely sent more than a few hundred men. Knights were bound by customary obligations that usually required just 40 days of military service per year. That limited service window had serious consequences. Campaigns had to be planned with strict time constraints, and large-scale maneuvers became impractical. Warfare had to happen close to home, and quickly, or it risked unraveling altogether as soldiers returned to their estates. In addition to these structural issues, economic constraints played a decisive role. The medieval economy was overwhelmingly agrarian, and coinage was limited. There were no centralized treasuries capable of financing prolonged military campaigns. Without a strong tax base or a regular revenue system, kings couldn't maintain professional standing armies. Instead, they relied on part-time levies and temporary feudal forces. Any attempt to hire full-time troops or mercenaries required enormous financial effort, and often depended on exceptional events, like the sale of crown lands or special war taxes approved by assemblies of nobles. Logistics were equally underdeveloped. Supplying even a modest force was difficult without a reliable system of roads, food storage, and transport. Unlike Rome, which had supply depots, courier networks, and state-run granaries, medieval rulers were forced to improvise, relying on local foraging or forced requisition. This made it nearly impossible to maintain large armies in the field for more than a few weeks. Even when large numbers were technically available, political instability and internal conflict often prevented their use. The lack of administrative standardization across regions meant that record-keeping, conscription, and troop coordination varied wildly between kingdoms. Furthermore, medieval societies did not prioritize the creation of massive armies. Military strength was understood more in terms of localized force, fortified positions, and symbolic power than mass mobilization. A king's legitimacy often rested not on the number of soldiers he commanded, but on the loyalty of his nobles, the strategic control of castles, and his ability to outlast rivals economically. That's why so many medieval wars were characterized by skirmishes, sieges, and short campaigns rather than extended, all-consuming battles. The combination of demographic limitations, decentralized authority, fragile financial structures, and primitive logistics made large-scale medieval armies not just rare, but fundamentally unsustainable within the social order of the time. Number 3. Logistics and infrastructure limits. One of the least romanticized but most decisive factors behind the limited size of medieval battles was the profound weakness in logistical capabilities and the poor state of infrastructure across Europe during the Middle Ages. Even when kings and nobles could muster a respectable number of troops, they faced an even greater challenge in moving, feeding, and maintaining them in the field. Unlike the Roman Empire, which had developed a robust system of paved roads, supply depots, and military engineering corps capable of moving tens of thousands of soldiers across long distances, medieval Europe operated on a fragmented and primitive network of dirt tracks that were susceptible to weather, seasonal flooding, and degradation. Most medieval roads were narrow, unpaved, and frequently clogged with the local traffic or rendered unusable by rain, making the movement of large armies an extremely slow and unpredictable process. The pace of marching troops was determined not just by terrain, but also by the availability of food and shelter. And in practice, even small forces could take weeks to traverse what today would be covered in a few hours. There were no permanent supply chains or organized logistics departments in medieval armies. Food supplies had to be brought by cart or pack animal, both of which were limited by the same poor roads. Pack animals consumed nearly as much food as they transported, creating a vicious logistical cycle. Consequently, medieval commanders depended heavily on local foraging or requisitioning goods from the countryside, which worked barely, for forces under 3,000 or 4,000 men. But as army sizes grew, this strategy collapsed under its own weight. Once an area had been stripped of supplies, the army had to move or starve. There was little to no central planning. Most armies lacked maps, and the ability to coordinate food distribution across units was almost non-existent. As a result, prolonged campaigns strained local economies, devastated civilian populations, and often collapsed before achieving strategic goals. In addition, the lack of standardized military camps or organized baggage trains meant soldiers often had to fend for themselves. This created further instability, encouraged looting, and reduced cohesion within the ranks. The siege became the dominant form of warfare in part because of these logistical constraints. Holding ground by occupying fortified positions was more feasible than chasing armies across difficult terrain. Castles and walled towns acted as logistical centers in themselves, places where food, weapons, and troops could be stockpiled ahead of time. If an army could reach a castle and surround it, it didn't have to move for weeks and could survive by drawing from the surrounding area, often at the expense of local populations. But even this strategy had limitations. Sieges were slow, and disease often broke out among both attackers and defenders, leading to attrition without any decisive engagement. These slow, grinding operations could last for months or even years, reinforcing the need for smaller, more mobile forces that could sustain themselves without collapsing under their own logistical demands. The lack of infrastructure also explains why campaigns were seasonal. Most fighting occurred in the late spring or summer, when roads were passable and crops were growing. Once autumn arrived, movement became harder. Supplies dried up and most armies disbanded or returned home. While Roman legions could campaign year-round, thanks to their infrastructure and planning, medieval forces were essentially improvised from the moment they left home. This had a profound effect on the scale and nature of warfare. Battles weren't just small. They were infrequent, dictated by when and where an army could even function. The inability to project force over long distances meant that many wars remained local with few decisive engagements. In this context, the small size of medieval battles wasn't a strategic choice. It was the inevitable result of a society that lacked the tools to wage war on any larger scale. The limits of logistics didn't just shape tactics, they shaped the entire rhythm of medieval conflict. Number 4. Types of warfare and strategy. The structure and rhythm of warfare during the medieval period fundamentally differed from the battle-dominated model associated with ancient armies or later modern forces. Warfare in the Middle Ages was defined far more by positional strategy, siege operations, local skirmishes, and tactical maneuvering than by set-piece battles between massive armies. Medieval commanders, constrained by the logistical, economic, and political limitations of their time, generally avoided direct confrontation unless circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. This wasn't due to cowardice or lack of martial ambition, but because battles were incredibly risky. Defeat in a single engagement could result in the loss of territory, honor, resources, and even legitimacy. Instead, medieval warfare emphasized attrition, disruption, and territorial control, particularly through the targeting of fortified positions and economic assets. Castles played a central role in this strategic model. Far from being romanticized noble residences, they were militarized administrative centers that served as regional strongholds of power. To capture a region, one did not necessarily need to win a battle. One needed to reduce the castle controlling it, or better yet, starve it into surrender without engaging its garrison. The dominance of castles on the landscape meant that siege warfare became a primary mode of conflict. Building siege engines, digging trenches, cutting off supply routes, and waiting out the defenders often proved more effective than storming a well-defended wall. However, sieges were slow, expensive, and uncertain. To mitigate these challenges, armies also relied on raiding and economic sabotage. Mounted troops, often a combination of knights and light cavalry, would burn crops, loot villages, seize livestock, and destroy mills, not simply for plunder, but as a strategic act to weaken the enemy's logistical base. This form of economic warfare aimed to exhaust rivals without committing to open battle. Medieval warfare also frequently involved political manipulation, marriage alliances, hostage-taking, and deception. Power was fragile, and a cunning maneuver off the battlefield could shift the balance of power more efficiently than risking an army in the field. Knights, although central to the chivalric ideal, did not operate as rank-and-file infantry in huge formations. They were expensive assets, typically few in number and used selectively. A knight required extensive training, a quality warhorse, high-maintenance armor, and supporting personnel such as squires and grooms. A feudal lord might command only a few dozen knights at best. These elite warriors were used for shock tactics, charging into disorganized enemy ranks, chasing down routed troops, or harassing enemy supply lines. More often, they led smaller forces composed of levies, peasants conscripted for short periods, poorly armed and lacking discipline. These levies formed the bulk of the most armies, but were not meant for prolonged battle. Their purpose was to bolster numbers, perform manual labor, hold positions, and contribute presence more than effectiveness. In this context, the absence of large-scale battles becomes logical. Combat in the medieval world was inherently asymmetrical, shaped by disparities in wealth, access to manpower, and geographical barriers. A small, mobile force could threaten a region by targeting its weak points, supply convoys, unfortified towns, vulnerable noble estates, without ever engaging a superior enemy in direct battle. Skirmishes, ambushes, and surprise attacks were far more common than cinematic clashes on open fields. When large battles did occur, they were often the result of a breakdown in negotiations, failed diplomacy, or a last resort attempt to settle an ongoing conflict. In many cases, commanders actively avoided battle even when they had the upper hand, preferring to wear down the enemy through other means. This was a rational adaptation to a fragmented, resource-poor military environment, where victory in war was often determined by patience, endurance, and control over fortified positions, rather than the size of the army alone. Thus, the small scale of most medieval battles wasn't a flaw in the system. It was a deliberate response to the strategic realities of the time. Number 5. Rare big battles and their consequences. Although medieval warfare was typically conducted with modest numbers, there were several notable instances where the scale of battle temporarily defied the norm and left a lasting impact on the political and cultural map of Europe. These exceptions stand out not because they were representative of the period, but precisely because they were so rare and strategically consequential. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410 is often cited as one of the largest confrontations of the Middle Ages. It saw the combined forces of the Polish-Lithuanian alliance clash with the Teutonic Order, with estimates ranging from 60,000 to over 66,000 combatants engaged. This level of mobilization was unusual and only made possible through a temporary convergence of regional interest, concentrated logistics, and a highly organized command structure on both sides. The outcome effectively broke the military dominance of the Teutonic Knights and reshaped the power dynamics in Eastern Europe, contributing to the rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the following century. A similar scale can be observed in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212 during the Reconquista, when the Christian kingdoms of Castile, Aragon, and Navarre united against the Almohad Caliphate in Iberia. Sources suggest that the Christian side alone may have fielded 50,000 troops, an extraordinary feat that required political cooperation and rare unity among fractious Christian kingdoms. The victory marked a decisive turning point in the Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, effectively ending Almohad expansion and leading to the gradual Christian dominance of Spain. These engagements, while dramatic, were exceptional not just in size, but in their strategic consequences. However, the great majority of medieval battles remained far smaller, even when their historical impact was just as profound. For instance, the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, despite being one of the most legendary events of the Hundred Years' War, involved only about 6,000 English troops against a French force that may have numbered between 12,000 and 20,000, depending on the source. Yet the English, using terrain and tactical discipline to their advantage, crushed the French nobility in a battle that lasted mere hours but resulted in catastrophic losses for the French aristocracy, and set the stage for further English claims in France. The small scale did nothing to limit the consequences. Similarly, the Battle of Hastings in 1066, a confrontation with possibly 10,000 to 15,000 total participants, altered the trajectory of English history by installing Norman rule, transforming the language, aristocracy, and legal systems of England for centuries to come. The compact size of these battles did not reduce their historical weight. If anything, the fact that such small-scale engagements could yield massive geopolitical shifts underscores how fluid and vulnerable medieval power structures truly were. Moreover, the limited military capacity of most medieval states meant that recovering from a major defeat was a slow and uncertain process. A single lost battle could eliminate the core of a kingdom's military strength, bankrupt its treasury, and trigger a cascade of political consequences including rebellions, succession crises, or foreign intervention. Because medieval armies were not permanently maintained and had to be rebuilt from scratch, for every campaign, a decisive loss could take years to recover from, both in terms of manpower and morale. This fragility meant that even battles involving a few thousand men were fought with high stakes and considerable caution. There was no reliable mechanism for rapid replenishment, and mercenary recruitment came with its own political and financial risks. Therefore, while grand battles like Grunwald or Las Navas de Tolosa make for dramatic historical episodes, the long-term reality of medieval warfare was shaped by the persistent inability to field or replace large forces, which gave every engagement, no matter the size, a level of significance that could rival modern conflicts in terms of national consequence. Number 6. The myth and the reality. The widespread belief that medieval battles were grand spectacles involving tens of thousands of armored knights thundering across open fields is deeply rooted in the influence of later historical developments, visual culture, and literary embellishment rather than any consistent historical reality. From the 17th century onward, the emergence of professional standing armies and the introduction of gunpowder warfare led to dramatic increases in the scale of military engagement. These later developments retroactively colored how earlier periods were perceived, especially when viewed through the romanticism of the 18th and 19th centuries. Artists, chroniclers, and novelists projected the scale and organization of early modern warfare back onto the fragmented and localized violence of the medieval world. As printing became widespread and national identities began to take shape, medieval battles were reimagined as grand, foundational episodes, glorious and massive, suitable for the construction of national myths. Tapestries like the Bayeux or epic poems such as the Song of Roland didn't document reality so much as they crafted symbolic narratives. These sources focused not on scale or logistics, but on drama, loyalty, betrayal, and divine justice, all of which required elevated imagery and larger-than-life portrayals of combat. Modern media further amplified these distortions. Films, television, video games, and fantasy literature depict battles filled with hundreds of CGI warriors clashing in synchronized formations. This aesthetic is compelling, cinematic, and emotionally satisfying, but it has little basis in actual medieval warfare. In reality, most engagements were small, disorganized, and brutal on a personal level. Medieval warfare was not a clash of faceless masses, but a series of intensely human encounters. Combatants often came from neighboring regions, shared bloodlines, or had personal feuds. Lords fought not for ideological causes or national glory, but for land inheritance, personal honor, feudal obligation, or retaliation for past slights. In such a framework, victory did not require the mass mobilization of tens of thousands. It required control of key strongholds, destruction of supply sources, or the capture of political figures. A few hundred soldiers could accomplish these objectives. A few thousand could shift dynastic balance. The small scale of these forces did nothing to reduce the violence. On the contrary, because battles occurred in local contexts without clear lines between civilian and soldier, atrocities were common. Sieges resulted in starvation and disease. Raiding parties burned farms and slaughtered livestock. Villages were often ransacked by both invading armies and retreating ones. The fluidity between legitimate military action and banditry blurred the moral lines of warfare. With few standing laws of war and minimal enforcement, the rules were dictated by power, not principle. And because most medieval armies were raised for short-term campaigns, discipline was weak. Commanders could not afford to punish soldiers harshly for looting when their entire logistical system depended on it. As a result, medieval warfare was deeply chaotic and devastating at a local level, even if it lacked the massive spectacles we associate with later periods. Despite all this, the myth of the large medieval battle persists. It's emotionally resonant, visually compelling, and symbolically potent. It offers a stage for chivalric valor, for clear narratives of good versus evil, and for historical continuity. But the historical record, military archaeology, and contemporary accounts all point to a different truth: that the Middle Ages were marked by small armies, localized violence, strategic maneuvering, and a deeply personal experience of war. Recognizing this reality allows for a more accurate and richer understanding of the period. It also highlights how warfare then, while smaller in numerical terms, was no less decisive or brutal. Power changed hands, empires rose and fell, and dynasties were shattered, not in battles involving 50,000 men, but in skirmishes, ambushes, and sieges fought by forces no larger than a modern sports arena crowd.